Hi, I'm Rob Welke,
I'm Brad Gollin.
and we're here with our MExit program to chat a little bit further about the process, the framework, and how it applies. Today we have a special guest. Elizabeth MacRae from Village Wealth has joined us. She is the co-founder of Village Wealth, and she's also a certified exit planner and a business broker as well. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hello, gentlemen. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. So we wanted to chat today about our process, the MExit process, which has the three stages of maximize wealth, transact wealth, and transfer wealth. And today we want to chat with you a little bit about the first two stages, which are the maximize wealth and the transfer wealth, because that's really a significant part of what you do with your business. So in terms of a business owner that's looking to sell their business, what would be some of the things that you, in your role, would suggest to a business owner would be the things they should do to prepare their business?
That's a loaded question, Rob. One of the biggest things that we see is owner reliance, over-reliance on the business owner themselves, and they haven't fully taken themselves out of the business, and becomes a barrier or a risk to an acquirer down the road. And it can take some time for an owner to pull themselves out of operations if they haven't done that throughout their throughout their tenure with their business. So that's one piece that we see. Another one is customer concentration. You know, when you're chasing these larger contracts and applauding yourselves for landing them, if they're a majority of the bulk of your revenue, it can become another risk factor to an acquirer. And again, diversifying that revenue stream can take time. So time is one of the biggest things that we reflect on when chatting with business owners. It's, you've got to know the timeline that the process takes and how much time you have ahead of you in your runway before exit, and how much time you're willing to invest to maybe pivot or do that maximizing of value as you're indicating.
Right. So the other thing that crossed my mind as you were speaking was the concern about potentially ownership of the clients. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the reliance of the business on the owner's relationships with clients versus, say, a salesperson?
Yeah, it can be a big deterrent for a buyer. So, I mean, their concern is, well, if you leave as the business owner, then what's going to happen to the relationships there? Yeah. You mentioned a sales manager, but if you have a single sales manager and they own all of the customer relationships, and if they leave the company, it's a similar risk. I always often reflect back on my dad's story. My dad was a produce exporter in Atlantic Canada, and when it came time for him to exit his business, he was the only one in the company that would travel to the clients. His clients were in the Caribbean, and he would travel a few times a year to go down and see them. And by the time he was ready to retire, they were with him because they were so loyal, because he had been with them for 30 years. Meanwhile, the market rate prices for products had declined, and his competitors were undercutting the prices. And at that time, when he removed himself from the company, his clients were going to chase price, because no longer were they loyal to him or whoever took his place. And so, price would have taken precedence.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like a good strategy for a business owner could very well be to layer those relationships and figure out and create different ownership layers for customers between the customer and the business itself.
Exactly. Yeah. And if the owners, if they're able to not be the face of the company, it's great. It's, often so many founders, they pride themselves on having that personal relationship with clients. But when it comes to exit and a sale, it becomes a risk for a buyer.
Right. Brad?
Elizabeth, I'd like to get a little bit more context to kind of put this in perspective. So first off, could you give me a little bit more about how you support business owners, where you get involved with them, and how long in advance of the transaction do you typically find yourself getting involved with them? So I'd like to learn a little more about how you support business owners.
Sure. So we've mentioned that I was a co-founder in Village Wealth, which is a tech platform, and it's a buyer platform. So it's sort of a different agenda being on the buy side, but I'm also the president of Commercial Ventures, which is exit planning and transaction services. So when a client comes to us, they're typically thinking of selling at some point. So people come to us at any point in the stage. They might come to us and take a course that, you know, they're planning to sell 10 years from now, or don't even have a sale on the radar. They just want to know more information. They might come to us when they have an offer on the table and they say, so we've signed this letter of intent and we've agreed to all the terms and now we don't know what to do. So we do a lot of teaching. We really focus on classes. If we can get in front of people early enough, we can help them understand what exit planning is, as I'm sure you guys are very involved in as well. And when it comes to the closing of a transaction, we have 2 transaction advisors that work with us to help people when they have that buyer already identified and they're looking to close the deal. So we're very much focused on the buyer's perspective. You know, how is a buyer going to dissect your company and position themselves to make an offer on it? And we really encourage people to understand the buyer's perspective at any point in the journey, because life happens. You know, there's the majority of business owners today are exiting because of retirement, but a great deal of business owners are exiting for many other reasons. And so it's just good business strategy to plan for the exit, plan for this company to be sellable at any point, so that you have the freedom to be able to leave the company for, you know, the appropriate value or maximum value if you've designed it in that way.
Yeah,
Does that answer your question?
That's perfect. That's you know, in a sense, your thinking is exactly aligned with the book we're writing and our own experiences with the companies we work with. You know, I really hear kind of 3 key points. 1, the farther in advance you prepare. And in fact, I think even from startup to retirement, you should always be building your business to sell. And I think I heard that in what you said. And then, you know, you talked about the criticality of that business owner being able to extract themselves from the business. So in that context, what do you advise them in terms of timing, or when do you kind of actively getting involved in pushing them towards that, building that transition, enabling the rest of their team, et cetera, et cetera? What's kind of the timing factor for you?
That's a really good question, because there's our ideal agenda and then there's the client's agenda. So, you know, oftentimes we start with the conversation, you know, when do you think or you intend to exit? And, you know, a lot of people will come to us and they'll say, you know, I want to exit 3 years from now or 5 years from now. And we have to dig into what does that mean? So, for example, if they're not as familiar with the sale process, you know, depending on how they structured the company, what is the transition period at the end of that time frame that's going to be asked of them to stay on? So, for example, you know, if the company's in high growth mode, but the owner has a lot of the reliance on themselves, they have a lot of the IP, the knowledge is just with them, you know, if the transition period is going to take any amount of time, they may be asked to stay on for 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 years. We just had 2 transactions close in December where they were tech and software companies and the owner stayed on for 5 years. That was the term of the agreement that was tied into the deal. So if someone is thinking about selling and they say, oh, 5 years, well, what does that actually mean? Because it's recommended that you plan for the sale, the actual sale transaction piece to be 12 to 18 months. So of that 5 years, the actual on the market piece is 12 to 18 months. The transition period where you may be asked to stay is 1 to 3 years, 3 years on average. And that's 4 years right now. So, you know, we start by framing the context of this timeline, if they still feel like I want to build maximum value and then I'll start that process. The more that you can pull yourself out of the company, the shorter the transition period at the end of the process can be. So it's kind of, the less preparation you do to pull yourself out, the more may be asked of you to stay on, or you may take a haircut on the price because it's a higher risk if you don't stay on. And so there are some other factors at play here. Sometimes, if someone has more urgency to leave the company and they don't have the runway to do the work and pull themselves out of the company, then, it may get tacked onto the transition in terms of a consulting agreement, or it may get, they may take that cut on price. If they do have time to prepare themselves and pull themselves out of the company, you have to think of those other things. If there is a cost to bring on another employee, how is that going to reflect on the financials when that is a new expense that's going to be reflected next year? Or what is the history? What is the implication of that decision? We just had this happen with a business owner out of the Vancouver area, and he has some staff that could potentially take over the business. He looked at hiring for his successor. He chose not to. He's brought his current employees up to be, he's given them a promotion. So these things take time to put in place, and he's done a good job of delegating his roles within the last 12 months, but he's still got some ways to go. So to answer your question, to come back to your original question, ideally it's more than 3 years, that succession piece to hire someone externally to come in and train or to bring employees up through the ranks. It takes some time. And even like if you end up hiring from outside and it's the wrong person for the job and you have to go back and rehire for that position, you've set yourself back sometimes. So it's really important to understand, am I selling this company at 65 when I'm ready to get out, or am I selling it when it's most appropriate for the business and I'm going to get maximum value? And what is the decision-making factor for when you're going to take that company to market? I hope that makes sense.
Great points.
Oh, absolutely fabulous. Now, a couple of things that came up in my mind when you were talking about that was, rather than focus on when you want to leave the business and plan that way, shouldn't you maybe reposition or create the paradigm of, okay, let's work from when you're gone backwards, so that we have a better time frame that we can work with, and you can actually help them understand better what the implications of that are. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I would definitely agree with that. I think like a lot of the work that we do as exit planners, and I strongly believe that there should be more exit planners out there, and I think it's becoming a more practiced profession in Canada. We're a little bit late following Australia and the UK and the United States, but it's becoming a more dominant practice in Canada. And I think a lot of the work that we do also when we're starting to step that owner back is reverse engineer the mindset. And sometimes we're reverse engineering some of their operations that they've built in the company. But yeah, is walking them step by step out of their job, essentially, without firing yourself. It's not cold turkey, but understanding that, how is someone else going to completely operate this company without you someday? And if you can practice that while you're still owning it, you're in the best position possible. One of the exercises that we've run in classes before is, we get everyone to raise their hand and say, how many of you can leave your company comfortably on vacation? Everybody puts up their hand. Oh, I can take vacation. And we say, well, how many of you can leave? Yeah, for more than a week. And then, the hands start to go down. More than 2 weeks, more than a month, more than 2 months. And we did this exercise once and we got to 6 months and one person out of like 20 still had their hand up.
Yep.
And we went, that's what everybody's aiming toward.
There's a sellable
Everyone in
business.
this room needs
Yeah.
to aim toward that.
Exactly. I mean, many business owners don't think about when they say, I can take a vacation. Many business owners don't think about, okay, well, who's going to take care of payroll? Who's going to pay the bills? Who's signing the checks while I'm away? Who's going to talk to the lawyer or the accountant if something comes up in the meantime? They don't think of those types of things when you ask them that question until reality hits and says, hang on, I can't really do that. Right?
Yeah.
It's a bit of
I
an
take
eye
vacation
opener.
all the time. Yeah. But leaving, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny
Exactly.
because go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Well, are they taking vacation? Or are they actually turning their phone off, or are they still checking emails and
Yeah.
Yeah.
managing tasks?
Well, it was interesting because my old partner and I, and a fellow shareholder in my last business, we got to the point where he could actually, it was difficult for him to do, but he would take mini vacations. Like he'd go out for 4 days at a time and then come back 4 days at a time. And we finally had to tell him, no, you don't have to. And thankfully, we got to the point in the business that when he became ill, and he was diagnosed with cancer, and he was running around Canada and North America getting treatments that were experimental treatments. He was actually away for 6 and 8 weeks at a time, and it never impacted the business at all.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good business. And I think, when people get put in those health situations and it's forced upon them, it's amazing how fast some companies will react, but essentially you don't want that to happen upon a sale.
Yeah. Well, and in reality, if that does happen, if they even survive that in some cases, they're doing very well, right? Because
Yes.
many businesses can't survive an illness of the key player in the company.
Yeah, exactly. And it's I've heard a situation where that did happen, and the gentleman who became very ill, and they weren't sure if he was going to make it, and the company scrambled to get everything in place and get their contingency plan in place, and they did well, and he came back to work eventually, and it helped him build that company to sell. Is putting him in that precarious
Yep.
situation helped the company eventually sell.
Yep.
Yeah, but you don't want to manage by crisis.
No.
That's
No.
not ideal. And a little variation on this, because in some respects, there's huge value you bring as a transition advisor, in the advisory services you do. From my own experience, though, what's your perspective on how good are they at executing on this advice, particularly when it comes to offloading a lot of their roles and responsibilities, empowering the team? What's been your experience in their ability to execute, and what do you advise then?
That's a great question. In our experience, it tends to be not necessarily in a sense of urgency, but when they can really see the why, they can really understand the why in their reasoning for making the changes. So, for example, like I run an exit planning course right now, and I've got people who are 10 years away, and I've got people that are 2 weeks away from wanting to exit. And the people who, yeah, it's quite a spread. The people who are 10 years away, sometimes they don't stay as engaged with the curriculum because it's not as urgent for them. Whereas people who are within the last 1 or 2 years before exit are like consuming it. They're emailing me saying, we had these discussions with our partners. We all listened to the recordings on the course. We're here, and they can understand like, okay, I'm not in the position right now to sell the company in the way that I want. And I need to make changes if I want to exit in the best way possible. And I think as exit planners, it's our job to really frame, things like, this is, if you were to go to market today, this is what it would look like. If you do these things and you go to market down the road, this is what it could be. And showing them, the gaps and the difference between, here's where you are today and here's where you could be, and here's what you need to do to get from point A to point B. It's our job as exit planners to frame that for them.
Yeah, and there are some tools out there that help business owners understand what the ROI on that activity is actually, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
So I'd like to
Exactly.
ask a transitionary question to talk a little bit more about the transfer of value piece. And the question I've got is, what are the traps that you've seen business owners fall into once the deal has been struck, the letter of intent is signed, and they're going through the process of selling the business, right? What are some of the traps that owners find themselves in?
So after letter of intent, pre-closing, you mean?
Correct.
Yeah. Also a broad question. One thing we see is like if they haven't done the upfront work to really get ready for due diligence, oftentimes a buyer will come to us when they already or a seller will come to us when they already have a buyer, and we're helping them through that final phase. And so we weren't there to help them with the due diligence, the prep work, because if, a lot of the items that are asked for in due diligence can take time to put together, or you need to bring other people in, like your accountant and your tax planner, in order to get some of the answers that are being requested. If you haven't done that before engaging buyers, it prolongs the due diligence period and it makes for deal fatigue. If they find skeletons in the closet or in the company, that's something that you weren't aware of, and you didn't find it first, that can change the whole structure of the deal. Things happening where a pandemic happens and, you can still keep a deal on the tracks, but now the terms have completely changed. Like we had a deal last year, it was ready to get closed in March or April, and the terms were 80% cash on closing with an earnout based on some milestones, but it didn't have a cap. So if the company did really well, they were in for a great cash out. Pandemic hit, and the deal almost fell apart, but our advisors did really well to keep it together, and it ended up being 40% on closing and 60% within 7 years. But now there was a cap. So now it didn't matter how good the company did, they were only ever going to get a certain amount. And that cap, that was quite substantial. It's a big difference having a cap in place.
And that's a huge change to the deal, right? In terms of, and that's something the owner had to all of a sudden acknowledge and accept as part of what happened.
Yeah.
Right? Because I know in our case, we had an offer on the table for our company, and the due diligence took just about 9 months. And unfortunately, because of the fact the due diligence took 9 months, the price of oil fell and all the money decided to go elsewhere because nobody was wanting to invest in Alberta anymore. So those are things that people need to be aware of that can trip them up in terms of their deal.
So
exactly. So sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, the sooner from the point of LOI to the final closing, you want that period to be as short as possible, because if you've provided someone exclusivity for a period to have due diligence so that you're not entertaining other buyers, but if that extends for any length of period, you've lost traction on the market with other buyers. And if this deal doesn't go through, then you're back to square one, and and things can really change in that period of time. So the smoother that process can go in due diligence, the better it is for a seller. There's a fantastic company here in Calgary called Kalos. They do transaction diligence. They're very skilled at creating the due diligence report, and I highly recommend them.
So I'm curious, in that kind of preparation for the deal, because I think some of the stuff you shared are some of the risks and things to be aware of, and some of the value you bring in helping business owners understanding the perspective and the positions that are going to be taken by potential buyers. But when we look at the building value phase, what are the things that you advise or warn business owners on in terms of the prepping for the transaction? What are the things that they need to do? A couple of the key things that they need to do or think of in their preparation and structuring to be ready for the best value transaction?
Yeah, really good financial reporting. At some point, one accounting firm, loyalty is one thing, but it's the same thing. As your company grows and as your net worth grows, sometimes you outgrow your advisors. And, at this point, sometimes they've become very good friends, and, you might feel bad about leaving them or going to find other experts, other advisors with different skill set to help you. But it really is important to make sure that your company is being guided by the appropriate advisors. You don't want, Aunt Sue doing your bookkeeping when you're a multi-million-dollar company, and there could be there could be errors that you're not aware of. So the quality of the financial reporting in the years prior to a sale is so important. It's, the difference between using a financial planner and moving up to a wealth manager once you get to that, certain wealth level. Again, your agenda may change. You've got more wealth that needs to be protected. And so you kind of have to, as your company grows, you have to raise the caliber of your advisors, is one thing. Your financials are, as Rob, you probably saw, as your financials were scrutinized. As much as you tried to focus on the future, your financials and your sale were scrutinized. And so making sure that they're very clear. A lot of business owners that are smaller in nature or owner operated at any size are often still writing things off within the company that are not, maybe, assets that are in the books that aren't used, in day-to-day operations. You're coming up against, qualifying for capital gains exemption at that point as well. So, the quality of those books in the last few years is really important. Does that answer part of the question there, Brad?
Yep. So I think that that preparation in terms of having that discipline around reporting, having that ready in advance, that type of thing. To me, it also implies, though, if you are getting that timely data and accurate, structuring it so that it is making your EBITDA look good, so your valuation is better, but also taking that information and using it to improve your operations. What gets measured gets done, what gets fed back gets done well. And so, I think that mindset that business owners need to have at any stage, where they're always kind of working to grow the business. How do I grow the business? How do I grow profitability and still maintain my other values? But if I really want to maximize my value, I've got to make this look good.
Absolutely. The one thing that we tend to see is that people were building to sell maybe a year or 2 years before they went to sell. So when they started that activity, they were able to increase their EBITDA, but it took a jump. And so a buyer's going to look at the last 3 to 5 years. And if they don't have that consistent history of growth or the consistency in the EBITDA, they'll question it. And so you might have seen, this last 1 year was great. You guys did great. But before that, what happened? So again, for exit planning, to have that historical trend from year to year that it's a really strong company or it's moving in this upward trend is so valuable as far as the EBITDA piece. Also, keeping those personal expenses out of it, having clean books. I think you had one more comment there, Brad, and I've lost my response to it.
Actually, I'm going to hand it back to Robert to...
Yeah, I just want to carry on with that EBITDA piece. Is one of the things, do you find that you have to help owners understand the difference between the way that they have been managing their books or their account's been managing their books in some cases, writing off personal expenses and such within the company? Do you have to explain to them why it's important?
Yeah, we do. And sometimes, it's by no fault of the accountants either.
No, agreed.
Their job is to save you taxes and to write, to find what they can to write off. And they really need to be aware of your exit plan. And this is one thing that we really stress is if you're on that trajectory of a sale or you think you might sell at any time, your accountant needs to be aware of it because they may do different, have different tax planning strategies for you, or they may report a little bit unique or have different recommendations. They may change how you take dividends or salary and vice versa. Like it changes the complete context and the perspective of your reporting sometimes. You get into the being a bigger company, or if you have partners, oftentimes the books are cleaner. We work with mostly owner managed companies. So we see a lot of unique things. Recently we went through the EBITDA recalculations and normalizing the EBITDA, so pulling expenses out that were personal to demonstrate, what the true cash flow is. And we did this exercise with a business owner, and they weren't planning to sell. They didn't do exit planning. They had a situation came up, and they made the decision to make, more or less a career change. And so now we're reviewing this EBITDA number, and we mapping what's happened in the company in the last few years. And it's really reflecting for them. You know, a lot of business owners aren't, you know, intimately familiar with their numbers. And it really is important to be familiar with the numbers and not necessarily just leave it, you know, to your accountant or your controller, because you're going to be the one that's often answering these questions from a buyer of what was this, what happened there, and they're going to map it year by year and look at your financial statements in, you know, in a single page or a spread, and they can pick out things really quickly that are inconsistent. And it was interesting when we did this exercise with the business owner. They're going, whoa, we spent a lot of money that year. And it's like, yeah, you had money in the bank account, so you spent it, and you really weren't aware of where it was going. And they're going, yeah, wow, I can't believe we did that. And had no
Who knew?
idea
You should have.
just overspent
exactly.
3 years. Yeah. And this was like, we were looking back and we were going, that happened 3 years ago. And they're like, yeah, I remember that. Like, wow, I can't believe that happened. So
Yeah, I get that, and I understand that thoroughly, because you know, if things are going well, they tend to spend more, but they don't think about what the future implications of that are going to be.
So I want to take a little different tack, because I know from our own personal experience in my own businesses and with companies we've worked with, one of the challenges quite often is, in order for them to prepare the business properly, they've got to engage their team. So when we talk exit plan, or you talk exit plan, I'm curious, because in my experience, there's two plans. There's the owner's plan for their exit, which is really personal to themselves, and really they need to talk to a planner, that they need to come up with theirs. But then to engage their team, I've found we have to come up with a very different plan, one that doesn't speak to exiting the business, one that speaks to growing the business to its greatest potential. Because that's what gets people excited, because that gives them a vision and a future and something to kind of work towards, that says, okay, things are going to change, but we're doing this to build something exciting that I'm going to be playing a key role in, which is a very different discussion and plan with your people versus your exit plan. So I'm curious kind of your experience and some of your perspectives on that.
Okay, I think, you know, business owners, this is a bit of a, you know, it's a storytelling, and it's, you know, telling the story in the right way. And a lot of business owners are afraid to talk to their employees about a sale and an exit. And it was interesting when I took my CEPA designation, they made a really good point. They said, you know, if your hair is going gray and you're getting up there in years, they know something's happening. And if you don't talk to them, they're going to wonder even more so what's going on when you retire. You haven't done any exit planning. You haven't done any, you know, you're still involved in the company, you know, every day. Who's going to take over this business when you want to retire? And they know what's going to happen at some point. And so, you know, the way that the conversation can be had with staff is, you know, we want to build this company, as you said, Brad, for, you know, to have it in the best possible position. And with staff, oftentimes the conversation needs to be as simple as, you know, if anything ever happened to me, the company needs to survive, and the company can't just survive, it still needs to thrive in order for all of you to keep your, you know, to still be employed. Like, we don't want to see anything happen to your jobs or see the company at risk or in a position that's going to put it in a stressful situation. And so I can't be the be all end all of the company. I can't be the face. I can't be involved as much as I am right now. We need to spread this out just in case anything happens. So that's one way that, you know, the conversation can be had.
How often do you find when you're going into a business that the employees really don't understand how critical that is for them to be engaged to make that succession plan work? Because I know in a couple of circumstances that I've seen from friends of mine that have waited too long to exit their business, the employees just aren't prepared and they don't know what to do, and the business just suffers as a result. What's your perspective on that?
Sometimes I think it's a matter of telling key staff, you know, making the decision who is going to be brought into this sort of circle of trust, who is going to be, you know, elevated. The conversations that they're going to participate in is sort of an elevated, you know, level of seriousness. And, you know, these conversations take time happen usually in the best cases over time. And so, it's leadership. And this is where, change management and leadership guidance comes into play as well. There's lots of amazing, leadership executives out there that help with succession as well. And it's, in order for them to step up, or where do they see themselves going in their careers? Do they see themselves taking on more responsibility? And sometimes those people aren't the best people to be in those positions of leadership moving forward. And so as you're having these succession conversations or making these decisions ahead of time, do you have the right people in the right seats on the bus when you need them?
That's a really good point. And just to follow up on that, it's really important then, it sounds to me, what you're trying to say without actually saying it is you need to have your team in place to help you develop that, because change management just doesn't happen. Role mapping and having the right people in the right seats doesn't just happen. It takes a level of expertise and a level of time, if you will, to be put in place properly. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it definitely does. And again, as I mentioned with, having the right advisors support your company as it's growing, the same thing goes for your HR and your team. There's real value in investing in, leadership development and sending your staff out to get the skills that they need. I was listening to a podcast recently. Dr. Laura Hambly is located in Calgary, and she has a couple career counseling and leadership development programs in place. And she was saying, these people who become management are not always people leaders, and there almost should be like a designation for leadership when people reach this level that they should go and get a designation for it. Oftentimes people come up the ranks and it's just, organic, and they got there and now they're a manager, but they have no formal training in it. They just got there through experience and through climbing the ladder. And so it really pays to invest in your people and make sure that as they're advancing in the company, that you are supporting them with the necessary training they need for them to have the roles that you need them to play when you leave. So again, like the right people in the right seats, but also, making sure that these people have to care about your succession plan, because it's the future that they play in your company, and it really does impact them. So it's, making sure that they really understand, the extent and their role within this greater, bigger picture and this bigger strategic plan.
Yeah, it's not only setting the company up for success in the transition, but setting the people up for success as well.
Yeah, and so many companies rely on their people. Their people are the business. Without the people and the culture, you have no company to sell.
Yeah. And
again, in change management, when a new acquirer comes in, and now they're dealing with culture integration, off a lot of deals, even after the sale, they don't thrive for a while until they hit their stride again because of the culture integration when it's, a strategic buyer, an existing company coming in and making the acquisition.
Yeah. And one of the things I find interesting on this, and I'm curious what your perspective is, in my experience, the last 12 years, I've been working mostly with companies that are aspiring towards growing to that next level, or companies that are on fast growth tracks, and how do they keep the wheels on so everything doesn't blow up. And it's interesting because what I find is the stuff we're talking about in terms of transferring over the leadership of the company and transforming the company to enable it to be sellable is the exact same stuff I would do to be able to allow the company to grow to that next level, 10 times bigger, because it's always about empowering the team. It's the team that's going to take that company to the next level, but it's also the team that's going to take the company to be sellable and to be successful and to be prosperous in any future.
Yeah, and post-sale, right?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And there's stories of, owners who did exit and, they had a plan for how they were going to compensate these employees who had helped them build, the value that was in the company. And then the owner walks away with his fat paycheck and the employees are there with their jobs, but, they helped build this. So how, involving them in part of the reward for them helping you build what you built.
Yeah. absolutely. Yeah, there's lots of different ways that we've seen that being structured, and that's topic for a different day. But it's definitely something that needs to be considered when you're preparing for that transaction. Is how are you going to keep them, not only compensate, but how are you going to keep them there?
Yes. And so sometimes we see, there's the situations where, so-and-so is going to stay with the company for X amount of years, or sometimes, those employees are brought into the conversation with the acquirer and they sign employment agreements with the acquirer for a specific period of time, and they're sort of locked into the deal as well. Or there's so many different ways to tie a bow on a business transaction and a sale. Yep. Everyone is so unique.
So one of the things that's sort of come out of this whole conversation so far today is you have to have a good story. You have to have a really good story to tell about your company, and a good story to tell when somebody asks you a question about deviances and variances in information. Would that be a correct thing to say? And what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the biggest question that a buyer is always asking is, why are you selling? It's one of the first questions that always gets asked. Mm-hmm. Usually a seller would think it's, it's the most obvious question, but they want to know. They want to know the story. They want to know, how you arrived at this decision. Why are you selling? Are you selling because there's something, amiss with the company? Maybe if you're not selling because of retirement, they're definitely curious about why you're selling. So, and the biggest thing that we say is you have to be clear and you have to be open and honest. If someone discovers something that was withheld, and the stories don't match, or you told a story earlier on that wasn't the same story later on, if they have reason to question one thing in the transaction, they will now question everything. Yeah. And you will erode trust in the way that you've told the story. So, the disclosure process is delicate, as what do you disclose at what point in the sale process, but also trust is so important with the buyer, because if you don't have trust, you don't have a deal. You don't have a deal.
One of the things I wanted to touch on that I really hadn't thought of before, but that you kind of framed out, is when you look at our model, you need to maximize value in advance, you need to transact for value so that you can keep the most value for yourself, and then you need to transfer value. What you kind of laid out that I really hadn't thought of is you need to think of and prepare and do the necessary work for each one of those phases. But there is a dynamics to this that I think is really interesting. You pointed out is that, and it's always about how we create value through this whole process. But if you don't create value at the front end, your comment was kind of, okay, well then you're either going to lose value in the transaction, or you may be committed to a greater effort to create value and sustain value in the transfer phase. So I'm really interested. I think that was an insight that I had not really connected before. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit more about that kind of trade-offs through each of the three phases.
Yeah, sure. So, and it can come down to the industry as well, and the growth trend, and some of the terms that are, and timing, exactly. So, I mentioned the two transactions that we were involved with in December, and the owner stayed for 5 years, those being tech companies, and the trajectory that the company had. In one instance, it was a situation where an owner was selling and there was multiple family members, and there was a dad who was ready to fully exit. He had mostly exited from operations, but he wanted liquidation. And so they were selling mostly to liquidate dad. The son worked in the business, and it was, being a tech company, they had a lot of potential in front of them over the next, 5 to 10 years. And so the son stayed, he was a predominant shareholder as well. And he tied the deal that he was going to stay for another 5 years before he retired. In that situation, he wasn't ready to retire himself, and he was willing and capable and happy to stay on and stay involved with that transition period. The other company that we worked with recently, they were almost, they were tech and software, and they were almost pre-revenue at points. And so they brought in somebody else because they needed more momentum to grow the company and propel the company forward. So they needed to bring in, that purchaser, and they tied in the deal to stay for another 5 years, because the the company was still somewhat fragile. Without that owner, they will never achieve the milestones that they hope to get. So it can come down to how, operationally sustainable the company is before sale, but also what is the trajectory for the company. If it's on a major growth trend and it needs that owner to stay on for a period of time, again, it's about timing the sale. Are you timing the sale when you're absolutely exhausted and you're at burnout and you want out and you'll sell the company for a bag of chips? Or are you selling, when things are going really well and you're going to capitalize on this momentum and get your maximum value? But, if they want you to stay, great. If they don't want you to stay, great. You would go either way. And you're in a better position if you are fine to stay or not stay. Because if you're like, I'm out, then, they may not be willing to pay you that additional earnout or, contingency payments if you're not going to fully commit your support or commit it to some degree.
Well, that kind of speaks to selling when you want to versus selling when you have to.
Exactly. And you want to sell when you want to, not when you have to.
Yeah. I mean, I've always been an advocate of you prepare the business for sale the day you make your first profit, right? Start down that path, because you never know when somebody's going to come along and offer you a deal.
Yeah. And with a lot of startups these days being in the tech space, I mean, that is still so much uncharted territory. And if you're doing something really well and you're getting noticed, you're going to get approached in the tech space. It's just a matter of time.
Absolutely.
Well, as a matter of fact, most investors in tech, and at least in my tech startups, one of the first questions they ask is, what's your exit plan?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't want to spend the next 20 years on a journey with you.
They want to know when their exit is.
Well, not just their exit. Think about it. In companies where I've grown or helped other people grow, different skill sets. Entrepreneurs who like to see a need, fill a need, create new things, do new things. Quite often, they're not great caretakers. So, that's why I find a lot of times when I'm working with businesses, we've got to get the business away from the founders quite often, because they can grow it to a certain point and then they become the limitation. And then you need a team, you need different skill sets and competencies. And so, I find a lot of times, I don't care if it's a startup or what phase, thinking about, where is your passion and how far do you want to take it? Because again, we know the numbers are there. 85% of most owners' net worth is in their business, and you really cash out when you sell it, not running it.
Yeah, exactly. And I really like how you put that there, Brad. Like, I think that, it's really important to know when to pull yourself out of operations or pull yourself out of the business altogether, and not just wait for this destiny of when I retire. There's so many other reasons why it's right to sell maybe before you get to retirement. And Rob, you mentioned it too, some business owners that just held on for too long. And there is a sweet spot of when to sell or when to get out of the way. We see that a lot, Brad, where people, the business has grown above and beyond their skill set, but they didn't know what to do at that point. So they just kept operating as they always had. And it really put stress on the growth, or it stalled out. And then they went to sell because they didn't know what else to do.
And they lost, and at that point, they've lost a ton of value.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I find, just from those of us who have had experience, quite often you're getting courted the most when you're the hottest. And I think, if you go back to the sports analogy, it's always good to leave when you're on top.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting to see what's going on in the buyer market right now for, the companies that we're seeing with Village Wealth in the new startup is, we're seeing buyers that are interested in this 500,000 to 5 million space, because a lot of them are management professionals. They might be executives. They've come through their career. They might be, in their 40 to 50s. They know that they're at the top of the company, or maybe there's other managers ahead of them, and there's nowhere up from there in their career, or they have to go horizontally and sidestep to a different company, and they're kind of reevaluating, and more so ever now with the pandemic, they're reevaluating what they want for themselves. And they're saying, I have the skill set to grow a company. I've been an executive, but I want a business that I own. And they've sort of caught on to this concept that, there's a lot of business owners that are retiring, and I could just get into one of those businesses and I could run their company for them and grow them. And so in this conversation of this founder, this company outgrowing the founder, there's an inventory of senior level professionals that are wanting a lifestyle change. They've got cash, they've got enough for a down payment, and they're looking for what's next for them, or they're taking early retirement, cashing out, taking packages. We've seen, hundreds of people getting laid off in oil and gas in Alberta in the last 5 years. They've got cash and they're looking for a career change. Well, it's perfect timing that we've got a whole population of business owners that are retiring and need to sell their businesses. So that's why we built Village Wealth, is how do we bring these people together more seamlessly and educate, there are buyers out there for owner managed companies, and here they are.
I guess if you could do me a favor, if you had an elevator ride up with a business owner and you want to kind of give them 3 points to share in the elevator ride, what would be the kind of 3 things you would advise a business owner in terms of here's the most important things to get yourself to plan and prepare for your exit?
Ooh, I like that question. Well, number one, I would always default to, if you can pull yourself out of the business, do that. Number 2, I would say, start to get familiar with the timelines, because this doesn't happen overnight. And if you want it to happen overnight, you're not going to get the value out of your company. But number 3 is be really, really clear on what you want from a personal position, financial position, from a leadership position. What do you want for your company? What do you want for your employees? What do you want for value? Is value the most important thing? Or is the legacy that you leave behind for your staff more important? Or is your personal time more important? I recently talked to a business owner, and she said, we want to retire in the next few years. We have grandchildren now. And their company was smaller, so the potential that they had to maximize value was a little bit less from how they've been operating it. So they didn't, the difference between, a year from now and 3 years from now wasn't that much. And I said to her, the time that you spend in your company, because they both worked full time, and this was their second career. They had already retired, and they thought they'd buy a business because they were bored. And I said, the time that you spend in the next 2 years, what is that value? The difference between selling in a year or selling in 3 years, is your time more important than the difference you will get in that 2 years? Because sometimes, your personal lifestyle and your personal drivers are more important than getting that extra little bit of value. And what does that mean to you? So that would be my recommendation is, look at this a little bit differently, look at your mindset differently, look at the time investment differently, and how do you really want to be living your best life?
Yeah, so the opportunity cost isn't just measured in money, it's measured in quality of life.
Exactly. And a lot of people, they really enjoy their businesses, but they do feel more compelled that they have other interests or other things they want to pursue. And sometimes once you start to look at those factors, it starts to motivate the sale process. And you talked earlier about, how do you get people to actually make some of these critical changes in the business? And it's life after. It's, what does my life look like on a day-to-day business? Where am I going to volunteer? Or what other business am I going to start? Or what else am I going to invest in? How can I use this money? Where am I going to travel? And all those other things that you're going to do outside of your business, when for so long your business was, for so many business owners, your entire identity. And a lot of entrepreneurs are workaholics in some ways. I know I fall into that trait sometimes. And you've got to sort of have this vision for what your life looks like outside of your business and what's most really, truly most important.
So I just want to thank you very much.
Yeah.
I found all your points really insightful and wonderfully bang on in terms of, I think, high value ideas that every business owner really kind of needs to take to heart and develop their own plan around.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me on, and I really commend the work that you guys are doing, and I really hope that there will be more exit planners coming up the pipe in the next few years. I think it's very needed. So I thank you for your efforts.
You bet. Thanks again, Elizabeth. I really appreciate your time today.